Welcome to the Bodacious Women in Cannabis podcast, the show where the bold and brilliant women cannabis business leaders share their journey and their expertise. Here's your host, Susan Burns.
Hi, this is Susan Burns, your podcast host and on-call lawyer and business partner. I'm focused on supporting women in the business of cannabis on their journeys to success. In this podcast, we delight in showcasing women in cannabis and, in particular, highlighting their bodaciousness. Today, we are thrilled to be talking with Frederika Easley, and she is the Director of Strategic Initiatives for the People's Ecosystem. I cannot wait for this conversation. Welcome, Frederika.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. I love that word, bodacious. I just like saying it.
I do too. Well, let's start there. Let's do this one a little backwards. Normally I ask about your background, but what resonates with you about bodacious?
It's just full. It's a fun word. It's full. And there's so many ways that you can take it, right? I think it has a connotation that can differ depending on the road that you've traveled in life, But yeah, it's a fun word, right? And so I just think it means like full bodied, and not just like your physical body, but whatever body. So it's like body of work, body of energy, just space being taken up. So that's what comes to mind when I hear bodacious.
I love that, and I couldn't agree more. So we're going to talk about your bodaciousness in the cannabis industry, and I would love to know, I've been reading about you. You have a very impressive background, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you're doing today as the Director of Strategic Initiatives, and about how you got there, and it's your journey in the cannabis, especially as a bodacious woman in the cannabis industry.
Okay. Well, specifically in my role with the People's Ecosystem, which is an LGBTQIA women-led and owned business in the cannabis space. I have to point that out because that's very important. There is, as you already know, just a huge lack of representation, in terms of diversity at C-suite and ownership levels, and it's actually declining in cannabis, right? So 90+% of companies are owned by white men. And when you look at C-suite levels, it is abysmal. So I always have to start with that. I work with an amazing team. I work with and am led by amazing women, women of color, Latinx, and Latinx descent, as well as Filipino, excuse me. But in my role as Director of Strategic Initiatives, what I do is I look at policy, I look at rules, I look at regulations with a lens of equity. And so specifically, I'm looking for areas where language can be strengthened and or where language will intentionally or unintentionally repurpose harm, right? And so there's a difference between theory and practice. What you see in any space is that words don't always match how things roll out, or how people are actually able to engage with programs, policies, and positions. And so what I try and do is just bring the background that I have into a space so that as we're looking at the words, I'm thinking, well, how will this look? Will this actually do more harm or do additional harm, as opposed to the good that, that we're hoping will come from it?
Awesome. So, and I just want to clarify one term in the beginning of the interview, because legally cannabis includes marijuana and hemp. The difference being the amount of THC that's allowed in hemp is 0.3%, and if it's more, it's legally defined as marijuana. when you're talking about adult use cannabis, you're referring to the marijuana products.
Yeah, and I actually like to use cannabis, right? Because marijuana is a word that,
No, I understand that people like to use that term for a variety of reasons, but just the legal definition is,
yes.
is otherwise. So, but when you're talking about cannabis, you're talking about the marijuana industry.
Yes, I'm talking about marijuana, I'm sorry, cannabis, weed, reefer, all of those terms. Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, how have you been tracking and how have you identified like the stats that you just gave, 90% plus of C-suite positions are held by white men?
Yeah, so there are a number of reports that have come out in regards to this. So let's see, just off the top of my head, and some of these I can supply if you like. But if we're talking about like VC Capital, I know Crunchbase comes out with regular reports that specifically looks at VC capital that is given and at which stage of entrepreneurial development it's given. Now, they don't um, single out cannabis businesses, but this is just in terms of overall capital, right? And so you can kind of deduct from those numbers what the realities can be around such a unknown and market that is in infancy, such as cannabis. Leafly, I believe, had a report recently that touched on specifically like C-suite and ownership in cannabis and what those stats look like. I do not have them at my fingertips right now, but it's something it's easy for me to pull up for you.
If you want to send a couple of links that we can put in our show notes, I think that would be great for any of our listeners that want to follow up for their own, for their own personal use or business use. What have you been finding certain equity initiatives work where and others don't, or how are you approaching this and how do you advance your mission of sort of leveling the playing field, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I would say as states are regulating, so I try to be very specific and intentional about the words that I'm using. We know that cannabis is still not legal. We're still Schedule 1 federally, but there are states that are regulating and decriminalizing. And so as states are regulating, whether it be medical and or adult use, there have been some states that I would say New York. I would bring up New York as an example that from day one at least have language in the legislation that prioritizes looking at equity, that prioritizes at least acknowledging and addressing harms that have come because of cannabis prohibition and specifically the war on drugs. There are states that are playing catch up. So I would say like Massachusetts, Colorado, those are states that their efforts to regulate did not start with addressing those things, but as things progressed and as advocates, raised their voice and brought attention to issues that were coming up, they are now doing the work, right? Or over the last maybe year or two have been doing the work. I don't know that there is a state I would feel comfortable pointing a finger to and saying they have absolutely gotten it right. I think that what has to be done is that states have to be nimble. They have to create programs and create processes where they are able to pivot when necessary, right? I think there's going to be several years of trial and error that are still ahead of us. And so we have to make sure that one, we constantly have feedback. We have feedback from the individuals who are actually utilizing or who want to engage with these programs in terms of how those things are working. And then on the regulation side or the regulatory side, that things are not, that we're not caught up in so much red tape, and that it's not so difficult to actually make changes and adjustments accordingly. So I'll give you an example. In Colorado, one of the things, specifically Denver, if I'm recalling correctly, one of the things that they did was offer exclusivity for equity applicants, specifically in with their delivery license. Now, this was beautiful, right? Like, on one hand, you say, like, oh, wow, this is something that for, a set number of years, equity, those who have been impacted by this war on drugs are going to be able to get in, figure themselves out, kind of like plant their flags, if you will. However, they were essentially, their hands were tied behind their backs because they're not able to deliver their own products. They're not able to create and deliver their own products, which means that they are at at the whim of retail operators. And when you looked at retail operators and what that makeup was, there were not many people of color. And that's not to say that, just people of color would be the only ones to support other people of color, but there was some disparity there. Okay. And there was also not a program that was incentivized. So there was no incentive for these retail operators to actually contract with these delivery companies to do that, right? You had some areas outside of Denver, like Aurora, where they had delivery, but the retail operators, they controlled their own delivery. And so recently, I know Denver has extended, or they're expanding this exclusivity piece, but you had a lot of retail operators who it seemed like they were just trying to wait out the period of exclusivity so that, they could start their own delivery, their own delivery business. So we have to like think through, okay, here's a good thing that you're trying to do with this exclusivity, but how does it actually work out?
And that's the same thing I've read about different equity license application processes. Like, we're giving priority to people who had been disadvantaged by the war on drugs. Okay, well, they get the licenses and they have no business acumen, there's no training, there's no infrastructure, or there's somebody else that's putting in the money behind it. They fail, and then that person swoops in and grabs the license. It's what one thing I've been talking with other people about is, like, not having a cap on licensing. Like, I don't know what the reason is for the limiting the number of licenses in the state to 5 or 10. What would that look like if you just didn't have a cap?
Well, you have an example of that with Oklahoma. So Oklahoma doesn't have the cap. I believe New Mexico doesn't have a cap, and you have a very different experience there. They also have a low price point for entry. And so you have a very different experience there in terms of entrepreneurs trying to get into the market, right? I believe early on, right, a part of the cap was because this was so unknown and people were worried about, um, retail locations basically being like neighborhoods, like corner stores, so to speak, right? Like, they were worried about, these locations basically flooding the neighborhoods, right? On the flip side, what we have is,
Like, if they'd be right next to the neighborhood liquor store, perhaps.
I mean, pick your vice, um, pick your substance, if you will, right? But that we know that liquor is tolerated and it is viewed differently than cannabis. And there's been huge PR. I'm a part of the Dare era, right? So I remember those commercials say, no, this is your brain on drugs, this is your brain out on drugs, with the fried egg and, all that kind of thing. And then others, rightfully so, have seen, family members, community members, jailed for this substance. And so there is fear, there is trauma, there are all those things attached to it. And they also understand that, like, again, cannabis is not legal. It's being regulated and is being decriminalized, but there's still this gray area, if you will, with consumption that we have to be careful of. So all of that still exists. So I would say initially my thought was like, oh, early on, there were, municipalities that were worried about, well, how does this thing look? But we've seen as recently as the regulatory efforts in New Jersey, where you still had about 60 to 70% of municipalities that opted out from allowing cannabis businesses to operate in their locations. So I guess we can't make that argument anymore in terms of the fear of being first and the fear of it being unknown. But it definitely is a dangerous place to be, I would say, an unfortunate place to be. One, because we're seeing this in California where supply and demand are not matching. And so you have the cultivation of cannabis, of flower, and of material that is out, they're out producing the locations that they actually have to sell to, because California is one of those states where a super majority of their municipalities opted out, right? So there are pockets that can have cannabis businesses, but the vast majority of the state cannot, which is wreaking havoc on the price per pound right now. And you have a lot of those small farmers, you have a lot of those small cultivators who are going out of business, right? Who are not able to stay afloat.
So it sounds to me like not allowing cities to opt out, municipalities to opt out, but to allow them to regulate would be a better option. And I still don't think there's a need for the cap on the number of licenses anymore. I understand that fear in the beginning stage, like, what is this? But I think what the repressive licensing system does is support this. It just supports the legacy market, which is what the legalization is trying to say. No, here we're going to have legal, predictable, healthy to the consumer products.
I think you're absolutely right. So here's the thing. A part of what I don't think many states have figured out is incentivizing legacy operators to transition into the regulated space. And to your point about these limits and the extra layer of difficulty that is created with trying to just navigate the licensing process and the cost around the licensing process. If I'm a legacy operator, I'm wondering, why would I even do that? You know what I'm saying? Like, why would I put myself through this? And most states are.
And then possibly not get a license, and then what? And I already have my customers that have been with me for years, and it all works. So
And so like states are using the stick approach. Like, we know the difference between like the carrot and the stick, right? So they're using like these stick approaches in terms of like, extra law enforcement crackdowns, or fear around health and safety. And look, let me just be clear, I am all
war on drugs too.
right. And so it's like, let me be clear, like, I am all for the testing of cannabis products, for the testing and for the regulation of potency and things of that nature. Like, I support that. I want it. Let me just be clear about that. However, to your point, Susan, you have people, I know people, I'm sure you probably do as well, who have had a weed man for decades. Okay? This is a person who they trust, who they have a relationship with. They have never had any issues with them. They know the quality, they know the price point. I mean, again, people in the legacy market are running businesses here. You know what I mean? Like I think oftentimes it is they are I guess I would say shortchanged, and the scope and the efficiency of the organizations, of the companies that they're running, are devalued. But people are running like enterprises in the legacy, right? So people are not pushing out shit product, okay, in legacy, because your standing is based on word of mouth, right? It's based on your customer reviews. And so the last thing that you want is someone like dying from your product, or someone getting sick from your product, someone having anything but an awesome experience. So a lot of times when we're seeing these reports in regards to product that is laced, and product that has contaminants and things of that nature, I mean, I would argue that it's not really coming from the traditional legacy market. It is coming more so from those gray market areas, right? Like those are people who have taken advantage of this space where we are in the midst of regulating, and they've actually set up like brick and mortars, or they actually have like physical locations that people are coming to. That's not really your legacy operator. Like, why would they dive into a space where they now have like additional overhead costs?
Right. If it works, don't fix it.
Yeah. So again, like, states have to really think about, why would a traditional legacy operator, why would they transition into regulated?
How do we make that attractive?
Right.
So, in my ideal world, we would grandfather in legacy operators and license them. They'd have to apply and blah blah. But I mean, you would just have a licensing fee that wasn't like $100,000 or 50 or 10. Just a licensing fee. Go through the process and just license everybody. I mean, that might be too simplistic, but I think you would quickly, like we talk about, we're so big on capitalism and let the market do what it wants to. I mean, if you leveled the playing field and said, here, you're growing, and you got references that say you grow good stuff, whatever the parameters in. I know that's ridiculous to be that simplistic, but why can't we think of a model where we bring everybody in and then deal with whatever? Then if you say you can come in and it's not going to be this big financial headache, and you might have to shut down because you're not going to be the one that gets the license because you didn't pay a lawyer to help write your application, right? So if you're in, then if you have no excuse for not being in, then okay, you can have your big penalties for that. But I mean, to me, it just seems kind of ridiculous. But this podcast isn't about me getting on my high horse, but it's. I just was curious about what your thoughts on the legacy market are.
Yeah, no, so I agree with you. I'll say one of the things that we advocate for at the People's Ecosystem, and I know we talked a little bit before we press record, so like some of the other hats that I wear, right? Some of the other organizations, but one of the things that we are looking at and advocating for is amnesty, right? Um, and amnesty is not something that, people are kind of jumping at the bit at, right? Because what we're not talking about is leniency, right? We're not talking about leniency here. What we're talking about is a complete forgetting, right? A complete slate wiping. And so what that would allow is legacy operators to come into the space with the money that they have amassed, without worrying about being taxed, like back taxed in terms of 280E, without having to worry about giving up, their Rolodex, their black book, if you will, which would allow whatever product they have, of course, to be tested, before it goes into the regulated market, but for them to actually utilize product that they already have, right? So a part, again, I agree with you, and a part of what we're advocating for is amnesty for legacy operators, to have amnesty, to be able to come into this space. And that, not to say that there's no application process or no application fee, to your point, but to, one, allow them to come in at a position that is similar to what they're used to operating with, right? They don't have to come in just at ground level with nothing. And then also provide resources that allow them, right? Like, please acknowledge and honor the knowledge that these people have, but the fact that you are changing the game, so they are used to operating in one world, and they have essentially been operating very efficiently in that world. And now you're bringing them into this space where there's compliance and there's regulation, which may be things that they understand, but maybe not to that scale. And so provide the support so that they can transfer those skills, right? So that they just essentially kind of like learn this new language and learn the new rules of the game.
Yes, I agree with that. Okay, you run for president, I'll be your beep.
Look, I mean, women, we figure it out, right?
Yes. This conversation could be much longer, and it's such a fascinating area. What I would like our listeners to know, Frederika, is how can they work with your organization? How can they best support what you're doing, or get in touch with you if they want to work with you, collaborate with you on things, or how do you operate and where do we find you?
Yeah, so I'm on social media. Again, I am with the People's Ecosystem, so please hit us up at thepeoplesecosystem.com. I am on LinkedIn. I actually respond to this stuff, so you can slide into my DMs, if you will. I'm also on IG at Classic, so with 2 Ks, so KLASSIK 84. I have a bi-weekly podcast, The People Are Blunt, that, it is solely based on uplifting entrepreneurs, educators, advocates in the space of cannabis, specifically those from marginalized communities, so Black, Latinx, Indigenous, as well as women. And if you are a white male who wants to be on a podcast, I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to push you on acknowledging your privilege and how you operate in this space. And if you're familiar with allyship, right? Because this is, look, it's time to get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations, right? So all of those places you can hit me up. You can look for us. We're on all of the on the platforms. And then in terms of organizations that I'm doing work with, I am on Minority Cannabis Business Association's board. I am with CFCR, so that's the Council for Federal Cannabis Regulations. NYCCIA, New York Cannabis Equity Roundtable. So all of those places, if you are interested in getting involved or learning more about what we are doing, how we are commenting and trying to influence policy and regulation at both the state and federal level, hit me up.
All right. One follow-up question: does the People's Ecosystem work with individuals in states that are either trying to change existing cannabis legislation or that are proposed adult use cannabis legislation? I'm in Minnesota, which has just proposed a new statute for adult use, and in my opinion, the social equity provisions are sorely lacking. So do you work with states? Would that be a situation where People's Ecosystem would be involved or not? Is it something else?
So it's a situation where we can be consulted. The People's Ecosystem is based in Oakland, so we do a ton in Cali. We also have ties in New York, so we stay connected to that. We've done some consulting in Arizona, some consulting in Illinois. So it a lot of times just depends on like who reaches out to us. And then definitely at the federal level, doing a ton of work in terms of commenting and educating our elected officials on their efforts, whether it's CAOA or the MORE Act or safe banking or things of that nature. So really just, I would say that our tentacles are probably a little bit of everywhere, but a lot of it is based on who reaches out, who we have relationships with, and who asks for assistance. And if we can do it, we try and do it.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you, Frederika, for spending time talking with me today about this very important issue in the cannabis industry, and thanks for being bodacious and going after it.
Thank you for having me, Susan. It's been amazing. And I am so happy to be bodacious.